Take your family off my aircraft. Right now. Captain Daniel Brooks didn't raise his voice because he needed to. He raised it because he wanted every passenger in the first-class cabin to hear it. The words sliced through the quiet hum of the boarding process like a steel blade across polished glass. Conversations stopped. Flight attendants froze. Even the soft chime signaling the final boarding group seemed to disappear beneath the weight of that single command. Malcolm Carter slowly lifted his eyes from the children's activity book he had been helping his 9-year-old daughter color. He wore faded blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal sweatshirt without a single designer logo. Beside him, his wife Naomi rested one hand gently on their daughter's shoulder while their 12-year-old son Ethan looked back and forth between his father and the captain, trying to understand what had just happened. Malcolm's expression never changed. His breathing remained steady. His posture never shifted. Around them, passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. A businessman near the aisle quietly removed one earbud. An elderly woman lowered the novel she had been reading. Across the cabin, a young travel vlogger subtly angled her phone toward the confrontation without pressing record, unsure whether she was witnessing an ordinary dispute or something much larger. Captain Brooks stepped closer. His crisp uniform, polished wings, and commanding posture projected complete confidence. "I won't repeat myself again," he said. "This family needs to leave before we close this door." Malcolm looked directly into the captain's eyes. There was no anger in his face, only a calm that seemed strangely out of place. "May I ask why?" he said evenly. Brooks folded his arms. "Because I decide who flies safely on this aircraft." A silence settled over the cabin, heavier than before. Naomi gently squeezed her husband's hand beneath the armrest. She had seen that look in his eyes before. It was the same quiet patience he carried into difficult board meetings, complicated negotiations, and moments when emotions tempted others to lose control. Their daughter Zoe looked up at him, confusion filling her face. "Dad," she whispered softly, "did we do something wrong?" Malcolm turned toward her with the same reassuring smile he had worn since they left home that morning. "No, sweetheart," he answered. "We followed every rule." The words were simple, but they lingered in the air long after he spoke them. A young flight attendant standing several rows away shifted uneasily. She had scanned their boarding passes herself only minutes earlier. Everything had appeared perfectly normal. She glanced toward the electronic passenger manifest on her tablet, then back at Malcolm, uncertainty beginning to replace confidence. Captain Brooks mistook Malcolm's composure for defiance. "This isn't a debate," he said sharply. "Either your family walks off this airplane voluntarily, or airport security will assist you." Malcolm slowly stood, careful not to alarm his children. He brushed an invisible crease from his sweatshirt before looking once more at the captain. His voice remained measured, almost gentle. "Captain Brooks," he said, "is that your final decision?" The captain answered without hesitation. "It absolutely is." For a brief moment Malcolm simply nodded, as though confirming something only he understood. No one in the cabin realized they had just witnessed the first move in a story that would leave every person on that aircraft questioning what real authority actually looked like. Malcolm remained standing beside his seat without reaching for the overhead bin or gathering a single bag. His stillness unsettled Captain Brooks far more than an argument ever could. Most passengers who believed they had been treated unfairly became louder with every passing second. Malcolm did the opposite. He became quieter. Naomi looked up at him, reading the calm expression she had learned to trust through years of watching him navigate impossible situations. She knew that silence never meant surrender. It meant he was paying attention. Ethan leaned closer to his mother and whispered, "Are we really leaving?" Naomi gently brushed his shoulder. "Your father will make the right decision." Captain Brooks glanced toward the boarding door where two gate agents had paused after noticing the unusual delay. "We are holding this flight because your family refuses to cooperate," he announced loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man wearing a business suit checked his watch with obvious frustration, while a woman traveling with her parents quietly frowned at the exchange. None of them knew the whole story, but many had already formed opinions. Malcolm slowly turned toward the people watching. "I am sorry your trip has been interrupted," he said calmly. "My family has no desire to delay anyone." The unexpected apology caught several passengers off guard. There was no bitterness in his voice, no sarcasm, just quiet respect. The atmosphere changed almost imperceptibly. A young flight attendant named Mia stood near the forward galley pretending to organize beverage supplies while her attention remained fixed on the cabin. Something about the situation refused to make sense. She distinctly remembered scanning 4 valid boarding passes only minutes earlier. The family's names had appeared normally. Their seats had been confirmed. She discreetly opened the passenger manifest on her company tablet once again. Malcolm Carter, Naomi Carter, Ethan Carter, Zoe Carter. Every reservation remained active. Every security check had cleared. Every ticket had been purchased legally. She looked back toward Captain Brooks, confusion beginning to replace certainty. Across the aisle, the travel vlogger finally pressed the record button on her phone but kept it lowered near her lap. She was careful not to interfere. She simply wanted an accurate record of what everyone was witnessing. An older retired Air Force veteran seated near the window folded his newspaper and spoke quietly to the passenger beside him. "That gentleman has stayed respectful the entire time." His neighbor nodded slowly. "I noticed that too." Zoe looked around the cabin, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, why is everyone staring at us?" Naomi smiled softly despite the growing tension. "Sometimes people watch because they do not understand what they are seeing." Malcolm reached into his pocket and removed his phone. He did not rush. He did not hide the movement. He simply unlocked the screen and looked at it for a moment before placing it back into his hand. Captain Brooks noticed immediately. "If you are planning to call someone to complain," he said with a dismissive smile, "it will not change my decision." Malcolm met his eyes once more, his expression as steady as before. "I rarely call to complain," he answered. "I call to make sure every decision is based on facts." For the first time since the confrontation began, Captain Brooks felt a brief flicker of uncertainty, although he quickly buried it beneath confidence. He believed he still controlled every part of the situation. What he could not see was that the calm standing in front of him was not the calm of someone who had run out of options. It was the calm of someone who had not yet needed to use a single one of them. Captain Brooks straightened his jacket as though the conversation had already ended. In his mind, authority was measured by the last person who spoke, and he believed that person was him. He turned toward the lead flight attendant and gave a brief nod. "Begin removing their carry-on bags," he said firmly. "We are preparing this aircraft for departure." The word spread through the cabin faster than the sound itself. A senior flight attendant hesitated for the briefest moment before reaching toward the overhead compartment above the Carter family's row. Naomi quietly stepped forward, not to block anyone, but to stand beside her husband. Ethan instinctively moved closer to his younger sister, while Zoe held the small coloring book against her chest. She looked from one uniform to another, trying to understand why every adult seemed to have reached the same conclusion without asking a single meaningful question. Malcolm remained composed. "Please do not touch our belongings," he said evenly. "There is no reason to remove them." Captain Brooks answered immediately. "The reason is simple. You are no longer flying on this aircraft." His certainty echoed through the cabin like a final verdict. A passenger across the aisle finally raised his hand. "Captain," he said politely, "has this family violated any safety rule?" Brooks barely looked in his direction. "This is an operational matter. I will handle it." The answer satisfied almost no one. The retired Air Force veteran slowly stood from his seat. His voice carried decades of quiet discipline. "With respect, Captain, I have flown enough years to recognize the difference between a safety issue and a judgment call." Several nearby passengers nodded without saying a word. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted again. It no longer felt like a routine boarding delay. It felt like dozens of strangers watching a decision unfold without understanding the reason behind it. Mia quietly reviewed the electronic passenger manifest one more time. Every confirmation remained unchanged. Every boarding record was valid. She scrolled through the pre-flight notes searching for anything unusual. There was nothing. No alerts. No restrictions. No security flags. She looked toward Malcolm again, then toward Captain Brooks. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. The travel vlogger continued recording from her seat, careful to keep the camera low. She whispered to the viewers watching her live stream. Nobody has explained what this family actually did. They have been respectful the entire time. Comments began appearing almost instantly across her screen, asking the same question again and again. What happened? Malcolm slowly looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers instead of avoiding them. My family came here for the same reason as everyone else, he said calmly. To travel safely. There was no accusation in his voice, no attempt to embarrass anyone. His restraint only deepened the discomfort spreading through the aircraft. Captain Brooks interpreted that calm as another challenge. Enough, he said. You have delayed this flight long enough. Malcolm answered with remarkable patience. The delay began the moment assumptions replaced facts. Those words lingered in the air. Even the senior flight attendant paused before reaching for another suitcase. Somewhere beyond the cockpit door, the boarding clock continued counting down toward departure, but inside the cabin time itself seemed to slow. Every passing second pulled more passengers away from silent observation and toward quiet concern. None of them realized they were only moments away from discovering that the confidence standing calmly in the aisle did not come from hope, luck, or stubbornness. It came from knowing the truth had not even entered the conversation yet. The silence inside the cabin finally broke from an unexpected place. Captain, I need to say something. Mia's voice was steady even though her hands trembled slightly around the company tablet she still carried. Every head turned toward the young flight attendant. She had only been with the airline for 11 months, and until that morning she had never questioned a captain in front of passengers. Captain Brooks looked at her with visible impatience. This is not the time. Mia swallowed once before answering. I verified their boarding passes myself. Every document was valid. Every seat assignment matched the system. The words landed like stones in still water. Quiet ripples spread through the first-class cabin. Brooks frowned. You must have overlooked something. Mia immediately shook her head. I checked twice. She lifted the tablet just enough for the lead flight attendant to see the passenger manifest still displayed on the screen. Malcolm Carter. Naomi Carter. Ethan Carter. Zoe Carter. For confirmed seats. No alerts. No restrictions. No security notifications. The senior flight attendant stared at the screen for several seconds before slowly lowering her eyes. She had expected to find an explanation. Instead she found none. Across the aisle, the retired Air Force veteran stood once again. Captain, he said respectfully, if the crew has confirmed everything is valid, perhaps this deserves another look. Before Brooks could answer, the elderly woman who had been quietly reading her novel earlier closed it gently and spoke for the first time. Young man, she said, looking directly at the captain, I have grandchildren about that little girl's age. Her eyes drifted toward Zoe, who remained close to Naomi with the coloring book still pressed against her chest. No child should have to wonder why strangers are treating her family this way. The cabin grew even quieter. The travel vlogger continued recording without moving from her seat. She whispered softly toward her phone. People are beginning to speak up now. Comments flooded across her screen faster than she could read them. Some asked for context. Others urged everyone to remain calm until the facts became clear. A businessman who had seemed irritated only minutes earlier slowly stood beside his seat. I have an important meeting waiting for me, he admitted. But I would rather arrive late than watch someone be judged without a reason. Several passengers nodded in agreement. Malcolm looked around the cabin with genuine appreciation. Thank you, he said quietly. Kindness always matters, even when it changes nothing immediately. Captain Brooks crossed his arms more tightly. The support growing around Malcolm irritated him far more than the delay itself. This discussion is over, he declared. The decision stands. Malcolm simply inclined his head. Every decision leaves a record, he replied. Some are remembered for professionalism. Others are remembered for something else. Brooks dismissed the statement with a brief laugh, convinced it carried no real weight. He did not notice the uneasy expression spreading across his own crew. Mia looked down at the tablet one final time, then back at Malcolm. For the first time since boarding had begun, she was no longer asking herself whether the family belonged on the airplane. She was asking herself why someone seemed determined to pretend they did not. And somewhere beyond the closed cockpit door, unseen by every passenger on board, the first quiet notification connected to Malcolm Carter had just appeared inside the airline's corporate network. Zoe looked up at her father with eyes that searched for answers no child should ever have to ask. She tugged gently on the sleeve of Malcolm's sweatshirt until he looked down at her. "Dad," she whispered softly, "why do they keep looking at us like we do not belong here?" Her voice was quiet, but in the stillness of the cabin it reached far beyond their row. Malcolm slowly knelt beside her seat so they were eye to eye. His expression remained warm, untouched by the tension surrounding them. "Listen to me carefully," he said with a gentle smile. "Where we belong is never decided by someone else's opinion. We belong wherever we have earned the right to be. And today we earned that right just like everyone else on this airplane." Zoe nodded, although the uncertainty had not completely disappeared from her face. Naomi gently brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's forehead. She had watched Malcolm answer difficult questions before, but answering them for a child carried a different weight. Ethan quietly reached over and took his sister's hand without saying a word. Across the aisle, several passengers lowered their eyes. They had been watching the confrontation as spectators. Now they were watching a family trying to protect the youngest among them from a lesson no parent ever wanted to teach. Malcolm stood again, and for just a moment his thoughts drifted backward nearly 30 years. He remembered standing beside his own father inside a small regional airport after a stranger had assumed they were standing in the wrong boarding line. His father had never shouted. He had never argued. He had simply smiled, thanked the employee for checking the records again, and later told his son something he had carried ever since. "People can delay your journey," his father had said, "but they never get to define your value." The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come, replaced once again by the cabin around him. Captain Brooks watched Malcolm with growing impatience. He had expected frustration by now. He had expected raised voices or angry accusations. Instead he found a father comforting his children with remarkable dignity. Somehow that calm made Brooks feel even less certain, although he refused to acknowledge it. The retired Air Force veteran quietly cleared his throat. "Young lady," he said kindly to Zoe, "you did absolutely nothing wrong today." The elderly woman sitting nearby smiled warmly. "Your father is showing you something far more important than winning an argument." Zoe looked between them and slowly smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Mia felt her eyes sting as she watched the exchange. She discreetly stepped toward the galley and opened the airline's internal employee communication system one more time. A new notification had appeared that had not been there 5 minutes earlier. It did not explain anything directly, but it instructed flight operations to pause any irreversible action involving passenger Malcolm Carter until further review. Mia read the message twice before looking back toward the aisle. She had no idea who had issued the instruction or why it had arrived so suddenly. Captain Brooks remained completely unaware that anything had changed behind the scenes. He still believed he controlled every outcome inside the aircraft. Yet beyond the cabin walls, invisible conversations had already begun, and with every passing second the quiet confidence Malcolm carried seemed less like extraordinary patience and more like the certainty of a man who knew the truth was finally beginning to catch up with everyone else. Malcolm glanced once at the phone still resting quietly in his hand. The screen had already awakened before he touched it again, displaying a single secure notification. He did not smile. He did not react. He simply pressed one contact and lifted the phone to his ear. "Rachel," he said calmly after the call connected, "I need you to verify whether the executive travel protocol is active." There was a brief pause before Rachel Evans answered in her usual composed voice. "Yes, Mr. Carter. Your travel profile is active. Is there a problem?" Malcolm looked toward Captain Brooks before answering. "There appears to be a misunderstanding at Gate 21. Rachel's tone immediately became more focused. "Understood. Please remain where you are. I will review everything personally." Malcolm ended the call without another word and returned the phone to his pocket. Captain Brooks watched the exchange with open skepticism. "I hope that phone call was worth delaying 200 passengers," he said. Malcolm answered with the same calm confidence he had maintained from the beginning. I never make calls to create delays. I make them to establish facts. Brooks shook his head dismissively. The facts are already clear. Malcolm did not argue. He simply looked toward Naomi, who gave him a nearly invisible nod. She recognized the expression on his face. Somewhere beyond the aircraft, events had already begun moving faster than anyone inside the cabin could imagine. Several hundred miles away at the airline's headquarters, Rachel Evans walked quickly through a glass hallway toward the Executive Operations Center. She had worked beside Malcolm Carter for nearly 8 years. She knew his voice well enough to recognize that he was not upset. He was concerned, and that difference mattered. She entered a secure conference room where the airline's operational dashboard covered an entire wall with live flight information. She located Flight 417 within seconds. A yellow internal review indicator had already appeared beside the departure status. Rachel requested the event log. The system responded almost instantly with an unusual notation requiring executive authorization before any passenger removal involving Malcolm Carter could proceed further. She frowned slightly. That level of protection existed for only a handful of individuals connected to the company's founding ownership structure. Without wasting another second, she contacted corporate legal, executive operations, and the office of the board chair. No dramatic orders were given. No voices were raised. Professionals simply began confirming records one after another. Back inside the aircraft, Mia received another silent notification on her company tablet. This one instructed the cabin crew to pause all non-essential actions until corporate operations completed an immediate review. Her heart began beating faster. She discreetly showed the message to the lead flight attendant, whose expression changed almost instantly. Neither woman spoke. Across the cabin, passengers noticed that the crew had suddenly stopped reaching for the Carter family's luggage. Conversations became quieter. The retired Air Force veteran exchanged a knowing glance with the elderly woman seated nearby. Something had shifted, even if no one yet understood exactly what. Captain Brooks, however, remained completely unaware of the invisible chain of events unfolding beyond the aircraft door. Believing silence meant victory, he folded his arms with renewed confidence. Malcolm simply waited. He had learned long ago that real authority rarely announced itself with volume. It revealed itself through patience, preparation, and the quiet certainty that truth always reached the room, even when it arrived a few minutes later than everyone expected. The quiet inside the cabin was interrupted by the soft vibration of Captain Brooks's company phone. He glanced at the screen with mild annoyance, expecting a routine operational update, but instead saw a message marked Priority Executive Operations. Without thinking much of it, he answered the call. Captain Brooks speaking. The confident expression on his face slowly began to fade as the voice on the other end spoke with measured precision. Captain, before taking any further action, we require you to pause all passenger removal procedures immediately. Brooks frowned. Corporate does not determine safety decisions on my aircraft. The voice remained calm. This is no longer a routine operational matter. Please remain where you are until additional instructions arrive. Brooks lowered the phone and looked directly at Malcolm. For the first time since the confrontation began, he hesitated before speaking. It appears headquarters wants clarification. Malcolm gave a small nod. Clarification is always better than assumptions. The cabin remained completely silent. Even passengers who had been whispering moments earlier now watched every movement with full attention. Mia noticed another secure notification appear on her tablet. This time the message displayed a single instruction. Confirm passenger identity with executive travel records. She quietly completed the verification, carefully comparing every detail. The result appeared almost instantly. Identity confirmed. Executive protected traveler. She read the words twice before slowly lifting her eyes toward Malcolm. Suddenly the confidence she had sensed in him from the beginning made perfect sense. Captain Brooks received another call almost immediately. His shoulders stiffened as he answered. Yes. This time the conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, he looked as though someone had quietly removed the certainty that had carried him through the entire encounter. Malcolm waited patiently. He never stepped forward. He never attempted to embarrass the captain. He simply allowed the silence to do its work. Finally, Brooks spoke. "Mr. Carter, headquarters has requested additional information regarding your travel profile." Malcolm met his eyes with the same calm expression he had maintained from the first moment. "That information has always been available." Brooks swallowed before asking, "Who exactly are you?" No one moved. No one even reached for a phone. Every passenger seemed to understand they were about to hear the answer that would explain everything. Malcolm gently placed one hand on the top of Zoe's seat before speaking. His voice remained quiet enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "My name is Malcolm Carter." He paused only briefly. "My family has held a founding ownership interest in this airline for 3 generations. I currently serve as chairman of Carter Aviation Holdings, the largest long-term shareholder in the company that operates this flight." The words settled over the cabin like complete stillness after a storm. Nobody gasped. Nobody applauded. There was only silence. Captain Brooks stared at Malcolm, unable to hide the disbelief on his face. The retired Air Force veteran slowly removed his glasses, while the elderly woman simply closed her eyes for a brief moment as though everything had suddenly become clear. Mia lowered her tablet, realizing she had just witnessed the truth emerge without anger, without shouting, and without a single insult from the man who had been judged from the moment he stepped onto the airplane. Malcolm looked calmly at Captain Brooks one last time and spoke with quiet dignity. "A title does not make someone worthy of respect. Character does. Today, everyone on this aircraft has had the opportunity to show which one they chose." No one spoke for several long seconds. The weight of Malcolm's words settled over the cabin more heavily than any announcement the passengers had heard that day. Captain Brooks lowered his phone, but before he could gather his thoughts, it rang once more. This time the caller identification displayed the Office of Flight Operations. He answered immediately. "Captain Brooks." The executive on the other end wasted no time. "Captain, effective immediately, you are instructed to suspend all command decisions regarding this flight. A replacement flight operations supervisor is assuming authority until our review is complete." Brooks blinked in disbelief. "There must be some misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," the voice replied calmly. "Your recent actions are now under formal executive review. Please remain professional while further instructions are delivered." The call ended. Almost at the same moment, the lead flight attendant's company tablet chimed softly. She opened the secure message and quietly read every line before looking toward Captain Brooks with an expression of respectful concern. She had served under many captains, but she had never received an instruction like this. The message directed the cabin crew to preserve all operational records, maintain normal passenger service, and await representatives from airport operations before closing the aircraft door. Mia received the identical notification on her own device. She slowly exhaled, realizing that what had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had become a matter of corporate accountability. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged silent glances. No one celebrated. No one mocked the captain. The retired Air Force veteran simply folded his hands together and looked out the window. The elderly woman gently smiled toward Zoe, who finally relaxed against her mother's shoulder. The travel vlogger quietly lowered her phone. She realized the most remarkable part of the story was not the revelation of Malcolm's position. It was the dignity with which he had carried himself long before anyone knew who he was. Captain Brooks looked at Malcolm again, but this time the confidence that had filled his voice only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "I was not aware of your identity." Malcolm answered without hesitation. Respect should never depend on someone's identity. Those simple words echoed through the cabin more powerfully than any accusation could have. Naomi gently smiled at her husband, not because anyone had been embarrassed, but because the lesson their children had witnessed would stay with them far longer than this delayed flight. Ethan looked at his father with quiet admiration, while Zoe squeezed his hand and whispered, "You told me we belonged here." Malcolm smiled warmly. "And that has never changed." A few moments later, the boarding door reopened. 2 senior airport operations managers entered the aircraft accompanied by a corporate representative. Their expressions remained professional and composed. After a brief conversation with the captain and the cabin crew, one of the managers turned toward Malcolm. "Mr. Carter," he said respectfully, "on behalf of the company, I sincerely apologize for what your family has experienced today. We are committed to reviewing every decision that led to this situation." Malcolm acknowledged the apology with a simple nod. "I appreciate your professionalism," he replied. "My hope is that this review strengthens the culture of the airline for every passenger who boards after my family does." The cabin remained completely silent once again. But it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows when assumptions finally give way to truth, and everyone present understands that genuine leadership is revealed not by authority alone, but by the character shown when authority is tested. The aircraft door finally closed, and for the first time that morning the cabin felt exactly as it should have from the beginning. Flight attendants completed their final checks with renewed focus, speaking quietly and moving with calm professionalism. The conversations that had filled the cabin only minutes earlier faded into thoughtful silence. Malcolm settled back into his seat beside Naomi, while Ethan fastened his seatbelt, and Zoe carefully placed her coloring book into the seat pocket in front of her. She looked up at her father with a peaceful smile that had replaced the uncertainty in her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "I think I understand now." Malcolm turned toward her. "What do you understand?" Zoe thought for a moment before answering. "People can make the wrong choice when they decide who someone is before they know them." Malcolm smiled warmly. "That is true. But there is something even more important." She waited quietly. "Never let another person's prejudice become your opinion of yourself." Zoe nodded slowly, holding those words as though they were something she intended to remember for the rest of her life. Outside the window, the pushback tug gently began moving the aircraft away from the gate. The motion felt ordinary, yet everyone on board knew the journey had already become anything but ordinary. The retired Air Force veteran glanced toward Malcolm and offered a respectful nod. Malcolm returned it with quiet appreciation. The elderly woman smiled kindly before opening her novel once again, although she did not immediately begin reading. The businessman who had worried about arriving late simply leaned back in his seat, realizing that some delays teach lessons more valuable than any meeting could offer. Even the travel vlogger quietly ended her recording. She decided the story she had witnessed was not about wealth, influence, or corporate authority. It was about the dignity a person carries long before anyone recognizes their title. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Malcolm looked out the window for a brief moment before turning back to his children. "You will meet people throughout your lives who judge you before they know your heart," he said softly. "Some will see your appearance before they see your character. Some will hear your name before they hear your voice. You cannot control that, but you can always control the way you respond." Ethan listened carefully, committing every word to memory. Naomi reached over and gently held Malcolm's hand. She had watched him lead companies through difficult seasons, negotiate impossible decisions, and inspire thousands of employees. But she believed this quiet conversation with their children might become one of his greatest lessons. The engines gradually increased in power as the aircraft lined up with the runway. No applause filled the cabin. No dramatic celebration followed. Instead, there was something far more meaningful. There was reflection. There was humility. There was a shared understanding among strangers that respect should never be reserved for titles, expensive clothing, or public recognition. It should be offered because every person possesses inherent dignity. As the airplane lifted smoothly into the sky, Zoe looked through the window at the shrinking city below and smiled. Malcolm quietly rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He knew that today's journey would be remembered for many reasons, but he hoped one lesson would outlast all the others. Real strength is not proven by winning an argument. Real strength is revealed by remaining faithful to your values when someone else forgets theirs. And long after the flight reached its destination, the people who witnessed that quiet morning would remember not the man who held the greatest authority, but the man who showed the greatest character.